He was no prophet. He came from no priestly line. He was not a son of visions or dreams, yet on that day, the sun stood still for him. Who was this man, capable of commanding the heavens? What bold faith could make the universe hold its breath? What if a simple warrior could touch time itself? What if nature had paused, not for pride, but for loyalty? Today, we will relive one of the greatest mysteries of the Bible, the day the sky listened to a man and the earth stopped spinning because of a prayer. The day a biblical miracle rewrote creation itself. But more than that, we will uncover what this forgotten event reveals about spiritual authority, inner warfare, and the promise God makes to those who walk in radical obedience. The scene doesn't begin on a mountaintop. There is no fire, no rushing wind, only sand, stone, and the sound of spears being sharpened. Joshua was still new to leadership. The old Moses had passed. The cloud had lifted. The desert conquered. But now, before him, stood a land still at war. The promise was no longer a distant vision. It was a present reality, filled with thorns, enemies, and walls that could not be breached. First came Jericho. Its walls fell without a sword. Then Ai, a bitter lesson about hidden sin. But now, the challenge took on a new shape, a spiritual battle on a scale never seen before. 5 kings, 5 armies, a conspiracy set to crush Israel completely, and in the midst of it all, an unexpected alliance. Gibeon, a foreign people, surrendered to the God of Israel and cried out for help. Joshua didn't hesitate. He didn't run the numbers. He didn't ask if victory was likely. He rose. He marched. He moved with the conviction that if God had promised, it didn't matter who stood in the way. Dawn descended upon the camp. The soldiers breathed tension. The earth shook under the feet of thousands. But Joshua carried something unseen, a history with God. He had witnessed the sea split open, the manna fall from heaven, the staff rise on Sinai. Now that staff was in his hand, but none of that would be enough for what lay ahead, because in this story the greatest enemy wouldn't be an army, it would be time. And when the battle reached its peak, when the light began to fade and victory threatened to slip through his fingers like sand, Joshua would do the unthinkable. He would not pray for deliverance. He would pray for control over time. And the heavens, which once moved for Moses, would bow to another leader, a simple man, a faithful commander, a chosen one who dared believe that divine intervention was still possible. Because this isn't just a chapter in Israel's story. It is a reminder, when faith meets the promise of God, even the sun must obey. The earth trembled, not from quakes, but from fear. Joshua's name was no longer just known, it was feared. Since Jericho, since Ai, since the day the people of Israel crossed the Jordan with their feet firm on dry ground, the kings of Canaan knew something beyond natural was unfolding. But it wasn't the size of Israel's armies that terrified them, nor their military strategy. It was divine intervention, a people who marched to the sound of trumpets and walls collapsed, a people who fought and were led by clouds, a people who hungered and bread fell from heaven. Logic shattered before them. Warfare was no longer just warfare. It had become something greater, a spiritual battle. So they decided to act. 5 kings, 5 cities, 5 kingdoms that had once been rivals, now united, driven by fear of a single enemy, the promise. They saw that God's promise was real. They saw Israel advancing, and they chose to strike, but not Israel directly. They would strike Gibeon. Gibeon was strategic, powerful, well-equipped. But more than that, it was symbolic. Because Gibeon had made an alliance with Israel, they had surrendered to the faith of the people who carried the name of the Most High. Attacking Gibeon was a message, an attempt to shatter trust, to weaken the alliance, to prove that not every covenant with Israel was safe. And when the news arrived, Joshua had a decision to make. Gibeon had once deceived Israel. They had entered the covenant through cunning, but even so, Joshua had sworn to protect them. And now, 5 nations were on their way. It was still night. The ground held the warmth of the day. But Joshua didn't wait for sunrise. He rose, gathered his men, and departed. He had no guarantee of victory, no time, no reinforcements, but he had something those kings could never understand. A word, the same word that parted the sea, the same voice that thundered from Sinai, the same promise that had sustained them in the desert. Now it marched with him into battle. They walked through the night, no sleep, no rest, because when God's promise is on the line, you don't negotiate with fear. Gibeon was surrounded, spears raised, gates shut. But when Israel's army appeared on the horizon, enemy hearts faltered. There's something in the eyes of the faithful that disarms all arrogance. If you believe faith must face real giants, not just in words but in action, leave a like, share this story with someone who needs courage, and subscribe now to the channel. Stories like this still shake the heavens and must be remembered. The enemy wasn't ready for that kind of boldness. The surprise attack turned into chaos. Confusion spread like wildfire. But this wasn't the end, because as the armies clashed, time moved on. And Joshua knew victory had to come before the sun went down. Once again, the problem wasn't the number of enemies, it was time. The same time that limits human strength, but bows before divine intervention. And Joshua was about to discover just how far God would go for a faith that does not retreat. The sun had already risen when the first cries echoed through the valley. The dry ground of Aijalon became the stage for something far greater than a battle. Here, a clash unfolded between the impossible and what God had promised. The enemy army ran in disarray. Israel's swords pressed forward, but in Joshua's heart, a different clock was ticking, louder than the sounds of war. He saw time. He saw the light advancing. He saw the day slipping away. And with it, victory was slipping too. The spiritual battle wasn't just being fought on the field. It was against limitation, against sunset, against the idea that there was a deadline for God's promise to be fulfilled. Because Joshua didn't just want to win, he wanted to destroy evil. He wanted to finish what God had started. But how could he do that if night was drawing near? Then, in an act never seen before, he stopped, not to rest, not to retreat. He stopped to pray. And he didn't pray quietly. He didn't whisper under his breath. He spoke before all. His voice echoed through the mountains, crossed the valley, and seemed to rise beyond the clouds. Sun, stand still over Gibeon, and you, moon, over the valley of Aijalon. The battlefield froze. The soldiers froze. Time hesitated, because this was no ordinary request. It was a declaration. A faith bold enough to challenge the laws of the universe. And in that moment, the heavens had to decide, was God's promise great enough to suspend time? Would divine intervention go beyond the symbolic and touch the literal? All eyes turned to the sky. The brightness of the sun held its place. No shadow moved, no star appeared. Time had stopped. There, before thousands, a biblical miracle took place. Not a metaphor, not poetic language, a real, physical, cosmic miracle. The sun obeyed, not because Joshua was special, but because his faith was aligned with what God already intended to do. God's promise was conquest. Joshua's part was daring to believe to the end. His prayer wasn't a whim, it was a partnership. He wasn't asking for a show, he was asking for time to fulfill a divine purpose. And God answered as only he can. He suspended time to honor faithfulness. The sun stood still, but spiritual time surged forward. The battle wasn't over, and heaven had not yet revealed all it had in store. Because when God steps into the war, he is not confined by the light of day. He goes beyond, far beyond. What happens when heaven answers? When a man's prayer is neither ignored nor delayed, but met with cosmic power. On that day, the impossible happened. The sun stood still, And with it, so did logic, forecasts, and the natural cycle that had always governed mankind. Because the answer Joshua received wasn't symbolic, it was physical, real, undeniable. One of the greatest biblical miracles of all time. The light remained. Time hung suspended, as if the universe were holding its breath. The shadows of spears stood motionless, eyes burned from the brightness that refused to yield. It was as though the day had become eternal, a day outside of time, where God intervened to ensure that something prophetic could be fulfilled completely. But this miracle didn't come alone. While men fought in the valley, something even more terrifying descended from above. Stones, massive as hills, heavy as judgment, began to fall from the heavens. It wasn't rain, it wasn't weather, it was heavenly warfare. Scripture does not speak in metaphor here. It states clearly, more died from the stones God hurled from the sky than by the swords of Israel. God himself entered the battle, not as a bystander, not as inspiration, but as a warrior. This was not merely a conflict between human armies. It was an open spiritual war, where the visible and invisible collided, and what was at stake was a promise God had made centuries earlier. Since Abraham, he had promised that land. Since Egypt, he had been preparing that people. Since the wilderness, he had been shaping that leader. Now, it was time for fulfillment. But notice this, the miracle didn't come at the start. It didn't appear before the march. It didn't prevent the conflict. It didn't spare the sweat, the sword, or the blood. The miracle came only when Joshua dared to reach the edge of faith, when all that was human had already been spent, when he no longer had control, only dependence. It was at that point that God answered. And the answer was so complete, so overwhelming, that the biblical author writes, there was never a day like it before or after it, because it was the day the Lord listened to a man's voice, not just the cry of a people, not a chorus of priests, but a single man, full of faith, full of purpose. This is the mystery hidden in the battle. God could have won without Joshua. He could have sent the stones earlier. He could have stopped time on his own. But he waited for the voice, waited for the prayer, waited for the moment when a son of the earth would declare, Lord, I believe there is still time. And because of that faith, the entire universe rearranged itself. The biblical miracle we live today may not come in the form of a halted sun or falling stones, but it comes in the decisions where we choose not to retreat. It comes when we refuse to compromise the promise. It comes when we pray from a place where everything has already been surrendered, except hope. Heaven still responds, but it responds to those who fight not for themselves, but for something greater. And when the day finally began to darken, when the light gave way to night, the world had changed, and so had Joshua. Because no man walks away the same from a battle where God fights at his side. There was no other day like that one. Not before, not after, and after, only silence. The Bible ends the account of the miracle with no celebration, no music, no record of rejoicing. The sky, which once roared with stones and eternal light, now held absolute silence. Joshua had triumphed. The enemy army was crushed. The promise moved forward. But the echo of that day would not return, because there are biblical miracles that are one of a kind, not because of limitation, but because of purpose. And once they fulfill their role, they vanish like the wind that parts the sea, leaving no footprints, but changing everything in their path. Joshua kept leading, kept fighting. The land began to be divided among the tribes. Cities were conquered, treaties made, agreements established. But no other sun stood still, no other stones fell from the heavens, no other divine intervention came with the same weight. And perhaps that's the hardest thing to grasp. How does someone who once stood at the height of spiritual warfare, who moved heaven with his voice, who saw time itself freeze, keep walking in the ordinary? How does a man who witnessed the impossible keep pursuing his mission without waiting for more explosions from heaven? But Joshua understood something many forget. God's silence is also guidance. The absence of miracles is still an answer. Because life with God isn't built only on grand signs, it's shaped by faithfulness in the ordinary. He didn't stop believing. He simply stopped demanding. He didn't live chained to the past. He simply committed to what still needed to be done. And perhaps this is the greatest challenge for anyone who's ever experienced a miracle, to keep moving when heaven no longer shouts. Because it's not hard to have faith when the light won't fade, when stones fall from the sky, when time obeys your voice. What's hard is believing when heaven goes quiet. But Joshua kept going. He led his people to the end. He watched God's promise unfold across the promised land. And when he grew old, his final command wasn't about war, but about memory. Choose this day whom you will serve. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. He knew the spiritual battle hadn't ended. It had only changed form. Now, it lived in the heart of every family, in the soul of every tribe. In the choices of each new generation, the man who made the sun stand still ended his life in silence. No stage, no spectacle, no other endless day, but with the peace of someone who had fulfilled exactly what he was called to do. The miracle didn't happen again, because it didn't need to. Heaven had already spoken. The promise was already in motion. Divine intervention had already proven everything. Now it was time for the people to believe, even without seeing. And that may be Joshua's greatest legacy, to show that the miracle is only the beginning. The true calling is to remain faithful even when heaven grows quiet. Heaven doesn't always shout. Sometimes it simply waits for someone aligned enough to hear. The miracle of the sun standing still wasn't a spectacle meant to impress. It was a response to a faith already synchronized with heaven. Joshua didn't pray out of pride, nor for glory. He asked for time because he knew what God had already declared. His faith wasn't magic, it was memory. He didn't try to persuade heaven. He simply reminded heaven of what God himself had promised. This is where many stumble. They believe prayer is a tool to bend God's will. But Joshua shows us the opposite. Faith doesn't try to control God. Faith collaborates with him. And when that collaboration is sincere, the entire universe adjusts. Time bows, natural laws obey, barriers fall away. Not because man has power, but because God honors those who act in alignment with his word. It was true for Abraham, for Moses, for Elijah. But with Joshua, something rare occurred. He wasn't given the command. He took the initiative. And still, heaven didn't rebuke him. On the contrary, God confirmed the desire of a heart already moving to the rhythm of eternity. This reveals something profound. The biblical miracle that day wasn't just that the sun stopped. It was that a man dared to act like someone who knew he carried the favor of God. Spiritual battles aren't won with formulas. They are won with intimacy, with obedience, with conviction of purpose. Joshua didn't wait for more signs. He didn't ask for more proof. He simply climbed the hill, raised his voice, and gave the command. That kind of authority doesn't come from pride. It is born from surrender. Because only those who kneel when no one is watching can rise with boldness when all eyes are on them. Joshua's generation saw what no other had seen, but it wasn't by chance. It was because he cultivated an inner life aligned with God's promise. And when the moment came, the material world had to adjust to the spiritual, not the other way around. That's the difference between those who pray just to survive and those who pray to conquer. Joshua didn't ask for an easier day. He asked for enough time to finish the mission. And God, who is never late, chose to bring a miracle early to honor that courage. Today, heaven still waits for that kind of faith. Not the kind that constantly demands miracles, but the kind that walks as if the miracle has already been declared. The kind of faith that prays not to change the plan, but to see the plan fulfilled completely. The kind that doesn't quit halfway through the battle. That doesn't bargain with its calling. That doesn't need an audience. That prays out loud, even without certainty anyone is listening, because true divine intervention begins when the human heart has already bowed, and all that remains is for heaven to confirm what's already been decided within. The universe didn't stop because of a bold prayer. It stopped because of obedient faith, a faith that didn't seek glory, but full obedience. And if today heaven seems silent, maybe it's not absence, but waiting. Waiting for a heart that stops asking for control and starts asking for covenant, because when faith aligns with heaven, even time must obey. The sun began to move again, the stones ceased, time resumed its quiet course, and Joshua completed his mission. The land was divided, the borders were drawn, the enemies silenced. The man who had faced kings and won with heaven at his side now rested, old, peaceful, faithful. But even the greatest miracles cannot survive the neglect of memory. The Bible says, with a quiet, sorrowful weight, another generation arose after them who did not know the Lord, nor the works which he had done for Israel. The generation that witnessed the biblical miracle of the sun standing still was followed by one who only heard whispers. They were born into the comfort of the promised land, but without the fire of conquest, without the urgency of dependence, without the memory of the impossible. And so they forgot. They forgot there was a day when God stopped time for the sake of a man. They forgot that heaven once answered with stones from above. They forgot that the promises weren't just stories, they were destiny. Faith faded, altars were replaced with idols. The God who once fought their battles became nothing more than a distant name, and with forgetting came decline. Because what is not remembered is lost, and what is not passed on dies on the fringes of history. The spiritual war that had once been fought with sword and outcry was now fought in the quiet of lukewarm hearts. The promised land was still there, but without the awareness of who gave it, it became just another patch of earth. Joshua didn't fail. He fought, he taught, he bore witness, but time demands the price of what is not revived, and this becomes our calling, to never let the biblical miracle become just an old chapter, but rather a living reminder that heaven still listens, that divine intervention has not ceased, that God's promise still pulses through the pages and through the souls who believe. Which part of this story moved your heart the most? Leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and tag someone who needs to remember that heaven still answers faith. If this journey stirred something within you, subscribe now and turn on notifications. There are more stories waiting to be remembered, because faith dies where memory goes silent, and it only remains alive where there are those willing to tell and live what God has done. Today, you heard about a day that never truly ended, because as long as there is someone who believes, heaven can still stop time.